Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this dialogue seminar of Carolina Public Humanities, which will examine connections between civic life and public health in Spanish-speaking communities in both Latin America, particularly Colombia, and in the United States. I am Lloyd Kramer. I am a professor of history at UNC Chapel Hill and also the director of Carolina Public Humanities. And it is my particular pleasure to be part of this first ever bilingual seminar for Carolina Public Humanities, which is being presented in English with a simultaneous Spanish interpretation. And you can find the continuous Spanish interpretation on your Zoom link. And the Spanish interpreters are provided by the Tilde Language Justice Cooperative, which is based in Durham. And now my colleague Beth Gardner will explain how to access Spanish on your computer.
Thank you, Lloyd. Good morning, everybody. So for those of you watching on Zoom, and if anyone in this room is interested as well, I can show you during the break. If you'd like to listen in on the interpretation on your smartphones, we can set that up for you. But if you're watching on Zoom, if you are on a computer, look at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a little globe that says interpretation. If you want to listen only in Spanish, click Spanish and then mute original audio. If you keep the original audio on, you'll hear both Spanish and English. If you are bilingual, that's might be fun for you. If you want to just listen in English, you don't have to do any changes on your screen. If you are listening on a smartphone, you won't see a globe, but you'll see 3 dots. At the bottom of your screen, click on the 3 dots and you should be able to find interpretation and choose Spanish. The other thing I will mention is that in the materials for this seminar, we are doing a little experiment, and so many of the translations of written materials were translated by ChatGPT. I'm very curious, for those of you that are Spanish speakers, to know how it did. How is a robot at translating English into Spanish? If anyone has feedback, please email me or let me know in person. I think that's my entire spiel. Everybody enjoy. And for those in the room that are asking questions later, we just ask that you maybe speak a little bit more slowly. There are more words in Spanish than in English for the same sentence. So to help our interpreters keep up, we just ask that you speak a little bit more slowly and wait for a microphone. I think that's it. Everybody enjoy the seminar.
Muchas gracias. So I do thank you for joining us today in English or in Spanish, and I thank our Spanish interpreters who are Musde Hojati and Vicente Duran. So this seminar is entitled Modern Civic Life and Public Health Across the Americas, and it features 2 outstanding professors at UNC Chapel Hill. Ana Maria Silva Campo, who is a faculty member in the UNC History Department, and Laura Villa Torres, who is a professor in the Public Health Leadership Program in the School of Public Health. And our goal today is to understand how people who have been displaced from their homes and people who live in communities of migrants seek to construct a healthy community as they cope with the trauma of displacement and or the isolation of living in unfamiliar places. We want to discuss the connections between a healthy civic culture and the physical health of people who live in vulnerable communities, with special attention to immigrants and displaced people. This issue is connected with the humanities because people who feel connected to a vibrant civic or community life also have better physical health. You cannot separate the two. And civic life, and you won't be surprised to hear me say this, civic life depends on humanities-related activities, the construction of shared memories, stories, histories, the development of strong human connections in social life, the development the opportunity to participate in educational institutions, in community groups, in religious organizations. In other words, this seminar has a kind of historical thesis. And the thesis is that civic health is linked to humanistic values, and civic health is essential for good physical health. So we also want to look at how the specific and often different experiences of women and men affect the development of civic and physical life. How, for example, do women help to sustain a sense of community among displaced people in countries such as Colombia, which has suffered from decades of internal violence and migrations and displacements? And how do men who may work in the United States in the vulnerable position of an undocumented worker, how do these people sustain their physical and mental health without the opportunities for an open and vibrant civic life? These are the kinds of questions we'll be discussing today through the well-informed insights of Professors Campo and Torres. So it's good to welcome those of you who are in the room with us here at the Rizzo Center at Chapel Hill, and I also welcome those of you who are watching on Zoom and joining us remotely. We're happy for all of you to be here. I know some of you on the Zoom are attending for your first time, so I should simply note that Carolina Public Humanities has been offering public programs since 1979 to show how the humanities are engaged with the issues of public life, community cultures, and institutions in which we live. So this bilingual seminar expresses part of our overarching goal and mission, which is to show how the humanities help to foster stronger democratic societies and a more humane world. So I want to thank some of our partners who helped to make this possible, including the Mirka Baumberger Group at Morgan Stanley, the North Carolina Society, and the Carolina Alumni. The support of these sponsors and many other contributors make this event possible. I also want to thank Beth Gardner, whom you've met. I thank Paul Benici for managing the technology and the Zoom webinar. And we have a great CPH team. And before we begin, I would like to ask Margaret Avery to raise her hand. Is Margaret in the room? Margaret, you are receiving today your PhD award. I want to give this to you. This is your 50th seminar. You are a public humanities giant. PhD, Margaret Avery. Congratulations. It's a lot easier than getting a PhD, but it actually takes as long, because think how many years you have to participate. So I want to summarize our plan for today's seminar. We will have two 75-minute sessions divided by a break of about 20 minutes. And those of you who are in the room may ask questions slowly so that we may interpret in Spanish for our audience online. And we invite you to pose questions in Spanish or in English. If someone online poses a Spanish language question, I will bring the screen to our presenters and ask them to respond to the question. We have bilingual speakers, so that's not our problem. Paul and I will be monitoring the questions on the Zoom. Then we'll have this break of about 20 minutes between the two sessions, and then we'll conclude with a panel discussion on how civic health and physical health are connected. There's only one other thing I want to mention before we move into our first session. If you have your phone with you, please put this on airplane mode so it does not ring during the session. I always say it's a lot like taking off on an airplane. Our journeys will take you to unknown places, but we want no outside interruptions. Okay, so as we begin our first session, I want to introduce our speaker, my colleague Ana Maria Silva Campo, who is an assistant professor in the history department. Ana grew up in Colombia and completed her BA degree at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota. And before moving to the US, she completed all of her undergraduate work there, and then she moved to Michigan and did her PhD at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, which has a terrific history department. They have a good football team too, I understand, but it's the history department that is most important. Her work focuses on 16th, 17th century colonial era Latin America, and her dissertation was about the trade of enslaved people in the area around Cartagena in Colombia. She carefully analyzes how the religious Inquisition targeted free women of color who had built their wealth and independence, but who remained vulnerable to Spanish religious policies and the seizure of their property. I once heard her give a talk about this, and it's a very interesting project. Her emerging book manuscript entitled Travelers of the Half Moon Gate discusses the economic and social vulnerability of these free women of color in Spanish colonial society and others as well. This is the historical background for her talk today, which will focus on vulnerable African Colombian women who have been displaced during the recent decades of violence in Colombia. And how have these women, like their predecessors in the 16th and 17th centuries, sought to sustain their community and culture in the face of ongoing threats? Ana is linking her historical skills to her analysis of contemporary issues, and I'm pleased to welcome her for the presentation entitled Resilience Through Remembrance, Women-Led Civic Engagement and Community in Contemporary Colombia. Ana. Ana, come.
Well, thank you so much, Lloyd, for that introduction. Thank you, all of you, for being here today. It is such a pleasure to be able to talk about issues that I have been reading about and writing about mostly on my own, to a community of people who are interested in similar topics, especially relating the importance of humanities work and their impact in contemporary issues, especially in a place like my country of origin, that is Colombia. So my talk today will focus on the topics of memory, resilience, and healing practices through the case of a group of women known as the weavers of Mampuhan. And that is a word that is kind of strange and foreign even for me to pronounce. Mampuhan, which is a town in Colombia. And we will get to know the women's territory, their geographic location, where the town is, and some of the background history that eventually led to the displacement, the violent displacement of many of these women from their communities. pause for interpretation. After that, I will be talking about the circumstances that led these women out of their towns, and I will be focusing on the different strategies that they came up with in order to not only rebuild the social fabric of their communities, but to heal their own memories of trauma following the violent displacement that they were subjected to, and how they did so through the specific art of weaving and using textiles as a form of memory and community healing. So the big point I would like to make today is that these women used practices that are very specific to their gender, such as quilting. And through this process, they were able not only to create art, but also to create conditions for memory to become a care practice. So how they used memory as a care practice for themselves and for their communities. So the regional focus of my talk today is a sub-region of Colombia, which is known as the Montes de Maria, or the Mountains of Maria. It's located where the red triangle is, and that triangle is there for location purposes only. The region is not as large as the area the triangle is taking up there on that map. So this is the mountain area that I'm going to be focusing on, where the Montes de Maria are located. And this north coast here is the Caribbean Sea. So it's a region that historically and geographically is very tied to the culture and dynamics of the coastal area of northern Colombia. It is a region that has been affected by the armed conflict in Colombia, which I will talk about in a second, because the region is very productive agriculturally, especially with a history of tobacco production. And there's also a lot of land that has historically been used for raising livestock. So livestock agriculture and tobacco. In addition to that, the region is located strategically, linking the interior of Colombia, where the capital city is located. Bogota is up here on these mountains, and other main cities like Medellin and Cali are also located in the interior. And the main access to seaports is through this river here, the Magdalena River. And as you can see, the river goes exactly through those mountains, going out to the main export ports on the Caribbean coast, mainly the city of Barranquilla. So again, strategic area for communications, for trade, linking the interior of the country with the main coastal seaports. The departments that the Montes de Maria are located in, the political division, is within two different states, or departments as we call them in Colombia. One part of these mountains belongs to one state and the other part to another state. So it's the states of Sucre and Bolívar. And that means that institutional presence within these mountains is kind of also fragmented and divided. There's not just one local political authority in the region. It's kind of fragmented politically at the level of state institutions. And lastly, the region has a very significant population of African descent. So the region is very close to the city I study in my historical work, Cartagena de Indias, which was the main port for disembarking African captives for the slave trade to Spanish South America during the 17th century. So this whole region is still heavily formed and impacted by the dynamics of slavery back in the colonial era. And for that reason, the population here is significantly of African descent. One of the places I studied in the 17th century is a community of people who escaped slavery in the city of Cartagena and who formed free towns in the mountains of this region specifically. And that town still exists today. So this is an area of very, very deep roots and history linked to slavery in the region. The whole area of the mountains is divided between 3 subregions, and this is going to be important to our story. First, we have a Piedmont area, and this is more or less the shape of the political division of the mountains. The Piedmont area is in light pink over here, and that area historically was the most heavily or densely populated. That's where the main towns are located. The main town over there is called the Carmen de Bolivar. And it was a town that started to grow and become important in the region because of the tobacco export economy. So that's the Piedmont area. And then on the other side, we have in blue the coastal region of the mountains of Maria. This region is mostly characterized by plains, so livestock agriculture is very important here, and obviously direct access to the sea and trade routes through that area. And then in the middle, we have the dense mountains, which you can see in the photos here. The region in the center is where the town of Mampuhan, where the weavers came from, is located. It's a region that is a lot more separated and disconnected from the rest of the country. It's heavily forested. The roads there are mostly dirt roads or roads for horseback riding, not even for vehicles. It's an area that has been traditionally and historically disconnected from the rest of the country in terms of services, access to political and state institutions, a lot of poverty. And so that region in the center has very different economic dynamics than the other two, the Piedmont area and the coastal area. And over here in this photo, you can see a little bit of the Piedmont, kind of like flatter lands, and then going up towards the mountains. And this one here gives you a little bit of a sense of the dramatic elevation of the Andes and how thickly forested these areas still are. So in terms of the history of the region, this is taking us also a little bit out of the mountain area of Montes de Maria and going a little bit more to a more general history of the country and the region. And I would start with the late 19th century. So in that moment, tobacco exports started to pick up and grow. The post-independence era in Latin America was marked by these new nations, recently independent from colonial rule by Spain, were very interested in making money through exports of raw materials, including tobacco. So the 19th century was a period of a lot of economic growth. And in the region of Montes de Maria, that was specifically the case for the Piedmont area and the town of Carmen. So That brought a lot of prosperity to this region and a lot of different transformations. One transformation, for example, was the arrival of new merchants and a lot of very active and lively trade. So this was something new to the region, this kind of economic prosperity. And that would start to slowly change the patterns of land ownership in the area, because many of the traders and merchants who were making money from tobacco started to use those profits to buy very large expanses of land. And the change there was that large landholding had not been the traditional form of access to land in the region. Instead, the groups who had lived there and who were still living there had access to land collectively. And these included indigenous groups, Afro-descendant groups, and groups of peasants. So from collective use of the land, this tobacco boom and economy gave rise to a kind of different large-scale land-owning structure. This started to generate a lot of different conflicts, right, over access to land, who should be the owners of the land. Should it be the peasants who were working the land, or should it be enterprises and industries who were exploiting the land for the purposes of exports? So all of these different tensions kind of got worse during the 1960s and the Cold War era, right? So these more global patterns and tensions around property and around models for development in places like Latin America really intensified two different models for how the countryside should be divided up. Should the countryside be more, smaller plots of land for peasants to own and work, or should the Colombian countryside just be kind of given and sold to large corporations that maybe would make more profits for the nation as a whole? So in response to a lot of the tensions of the time, different groups of peasants in different parts of Colombia decided to take the land by themselves, not wait on the government to do anything, or do a deep land reform coming from the state up. So many peasant groups just decided to seize the land for themselves, with the slogan of the land should be for those who work the land.
Do you mind if we have one question? Excuse
go
me,
ahead.
because everybody on Zoom, just go ahead.
Who owned the land to start with? They're fighting over it now, but going back, kind of bring it up to where it started in the Spanish, and then you get the gist of it.
So your question is?
Who owned the land before the peasants started seizing the land and after the Spanish left? Is that correct, the question?
Yeah, thank you. So the landowners were mainly big corporations or individuals who owned very large latifundia. I don't know how to say this word in English, latifundio. It is a very large expanse of land with one individual landowner, and peasants just kind of working there but not owning those large territories. So the peasants started to claim those parcels that they were working as their own, saying, we are the ones working here, the land belongs to us now. So that was one of the strategies that some peasant movements started to develop around this tension and this conflict around the land during this era. Other groups decided to generate pressure for land reform by taking arms. So this is the origin of many of the guerrilla movements in Colombia, including the famous FARC. So just a note here, the process by which guerrilla movements started to emerge in Colombia is a lot more complex and complicated, with different guerrilla movements having different strategies, different objectives, and different types of allegiances in terms of ideology. But for the purposes of our story, the FARC emerged as an armed movement to fight for land reform. And that's the origin of the movement. The history of the FARC itself is also complicated, and by the end of the FARC in 2016, the main motive was no longer land reform, it was other things, but that is part of a different story, slightly different story. So basically, the FARC started to move in the 90s towards controlling the Piedmont area of the Montes de Maria, specifically interested in exercising power and authority over the most prosperous region of these mountains. So they take control of the Piedmont around the 1990s. They start to demand money from landowners, saying, if you don't give us money, we're going to kill your son, using threats and the use of violence and intimidation to demand payments from landowners. Sometimes they would actually take the land by force, again, through violence and intimidation. And so in response to this, many landowners and local political elites decided to create private armies, to fund private armies to defend themselves from the FARC. And these private armies are known in Colombian history as paramilitary groups who were not part of the Colombian state. They're not part of the military at all. They are private armed groups for the defense of elites and landowners in the countryside. So these groups began in the 1980s, and by the 90s, they start to move into the coastal area of the Montes de Maria to try to defend the property interests of those big landholders. And so the region in the middle became trapped in between these two armed movements, the FARC on one side and the paramilitaries on the other side. And the population there in that region in the middle was civilian population. And the big kind of explosion of violence in the region started after the 90s, when the paramilitaries started to move from the coastal area towards the other side, trying to reach the side of the Piedmont. And so most of the violence and the massacres that happened at that moment were caused by the paramilitaries. So the main impact and the main force driving the circumstances of the women who we are going to talk about in a minute came from paramilitary violence. And the image here on this slide is actually taken from one of the tapestries that one of the women made to represent what she had seen during these confrontations. So today I have chosen to focus on the phenomenon of forced displacement. I could have talked about many forms of violence that women and families, communities in general experienced during this period, but I have chosen the phenomenon of displacement because that way we might have an interesting conversation about migration, about people moving out of their homes for very difficult reasons and reaching another place to try to reconstruct a life and a community on the other side. So forced displacement in the case of Colombia was a systematic and deliberate strategy that paramilitary groups employed as a tactic to control different territories as they were trying to make progress towards taking that Piedmont area from the FARC. And what did this tactic involve? Basically, paramilitary groups would arrive into a town and force people to leave overnight, literally overnight. It would be something that would involve a lot of intimidation, killings of community members so that the population would be compelled to leave everything behind and just leave the following day. So people were forced to abandon their homes and their communities. And here, the image at the top is a photo of an abandoned house in the town of Mampuhan, where the women, the weavers, came from. And you can see the dimensions, the proportions of this process. The structures and the houses were completely abandoned. And this is another town in the same region where you can see kind of a different kind of infrastructure. So it's not concrete houses made of concrete. It's even more precarious. So these communities were already very precarious before the experience of displacement. So by forcing people out of their homes, the paramilitary groups were trying to instill terror among the population. And they were also trying to make a point about public space, about how they were taking public space and making it a site of not wanting to return. So they wanted to vacate these places and start processes of just emptying the territory so that people who left would never want to go back. So it was a strategy of appropriation. And it wasn't about just physical expulsion, but as I said, also deep psychological fear so that people wouldn't want to come back to their towns. Of course, forced displacement had many difficult impacts. Families were uprooted suddenly. They didn't have time to prepare or to gather their belongings. They were uprooted from their homes, and also they couldn't bring possessions with them. Just whatever they could grab and take, that's what they had for the rest of their journey. This included clothes, medications, leaving gardens behind, maybe with medicinal plants, not only food, leaving animals behind, livestock or pets. So it was a process of deep loss. And this obviously also included the loss of family members who had been murdered in the process. So what we're seeing here is really a moment of deep trauma. It's almost unspeakable loss for these women and the people who went through these experiences, right? These were moments in which community structures were broken, processes in which people could no longer know who they could trust, right? They arrived in a neighboring town. They were welcomed by the people of that neighboring town for a little bit. the local government of that town created a structure for people to stay at while they were relocated or resettled. They all stayed at the local school. And we're talking about 245 families who left the town of Mampuhan and just suddenly arrived in another town without a place to stay, without sanitary infrastructure, nothing like that. So some of the people who survived this process have talked about what the experience was like. And they remember that at the time, they thought they were going to be in this new town for maybe a week. But they were there for almost 3 years without really knowing where else to go or how to return or where to return to. They talk about experiences of overcrowding. This is one of the things that people remember the most, the overcrowding at the school, and the sanitary conditions, the inability to care for children, elderly family members, etc. And they remember also that local churches were very important in providing some kind of assistance. And it was a church member, a Catholic priest who was from Italy, who started to collect funds back in Italy to raise some money so that the displaced community could buy some new land nearby and start a new town. So eventually the money came from Italy. The community members were able to purchase plots of land nearby, and they founded a town that they named New Mampuhan, so the new town. And some people would call it Roses of Mampuhan, Rosas de Mampuhan. So there was already a sense of hope in creating this new town. So when the community arrived in New Mampuhan, some of the community members started an organization called As Vidas in the year 2002, trying to, do community initiatives for reconciliation and for trying to repair not just the material structures of the town, but also the life of the community. But it was a community that was led by men. And this is the account from the women's perspective, right? So they saw the women that although this association was there to promote reconciliation in the public sphere, women were not finding a way to have a voice that was meaningful to them and to their own needs at the time. So they decided to create their own collective to try to find spaces that would work for their own personal and community needs. So they started to get together. Initially, it was 40 women who got together and started to do quilting work. And there's an interesting part of this story here in which it was an American female pastor who taught the community about quilting techniques. And so the women learned about the actual technique, but what was important here was that they started to quilt textiles and tapestries that told the stories they had witnessed. So at first, the women remember quilting tapestries that were very dark. The colors were dark. The themes were difficult. They remember having opportunities to recall family and community members by choosing the types of fabric they would use to represent that person in the textile, saying things like, "Oh, neighbor Juan, he used to wear a shirt that was kind of like this." And they would find a piece of cloth that resembled and reminded them of that community member. Or maybe they would remember what another person's hair looked like with the fabric, and they would kind of present that person and put her or him within the story in the tapestries. So some of these women remember that these first meetings and gatherings to create the first tapestries were very emotional. And they remember crying over these tapestries, just remembering what had happened to them. But they also remember that eventually the tapestries started to look more colorful. And there were new themes coming out of these stories. In this one in particular, this woman represented the way in which she sees her community, the way in which she remembers the landscape with the mountains in the middle. She remembers that she really enjoys sports, especially soccer, in a community space. She also remembers traditional forms of cooking. And here we see a person grounding corn in this traditional technique. The ways in which women in this region carry fruit over their heads. So very slowly, the tapestry started to show a transformation, not just in the art itself, its colors, its themes, but also something else that had happened for the women, right? They were able to talk about hope and not just about the trauma, the unspeakable trauma of the past. So basically, at this point, these women discovered that quilting was a healing practice that was specifically significant in terms of helping process unspeakable trauma. And the way in which they now describe this process and how they felt it was helpful to them was that not knowing how to even articulate the loss they had been through, they were able to express parts of that story through layers of different meaning-making practices. So for example, some of them remember not being able to quite express some of their memories in words, but they were able to choose a piece of fabric that felt to the touch, had a texture that could maybe represent something that they were feeling or remembering, even more accurately than words. As I was saying earlier, it was very powerful to be able to choose a piece of fabric that would maybe remind the community of how a person used to dress, even more than describing that with words to the rest of the community. So the kind of use of the senses, the sense of the touch, and creating meaning through that was available through women, through quilting, in a way that wasn't maybe available to other memory practices, like storytelling alone, or like archival research, or the other methods that we use as historians all the time. The other thing that the women have talked about as important in this type of memory making practice is the use of fabrics as layers. So they can actually put a literal layer of fabric on top of another to signify meanings of things that they kind of wouldn't know how to express otherwise. So when we look at the tapestries, we might not see those layers, but the women who made them know what's underneath some of the pieces of cloth in these tapestries. So in a way, the tapestries have become a repertoire of memory by capturing individual experiences and also appealing to the community and providing a space for the community to process loss. And there are some very interesting characteristics of women-led memory initiatives. So, for example, one of the characteristics of women-led memory initiatives in Colombia is that some of these practices are very close to the body itself. So one example is what I was just saying in terms of the sense of touch. So bringing the body and the senses to the process of memory making has been very specific to the ways in which women create spaces for remembrance. And this has to do with some of the specific ways in which many of these women experienced violence, right, through their own physical bodies. And so this is a beautiful example of that. Here we see the body of an Afro-Colombian woman. There's some kind of fire at the top with people fleeing. But there's also a river that carries life around across the woman's body. There are children playing and planting new plants and crops in the bottom. And in this figure, the woman is holding all of this within the figure of her body. So that's kind of a very different thing of these women-led initiatives. The second one, which is very important for the purposes of our talk and our conversation today, is that by gathering, these women also redefined the idea of care and what care means for a community. So how did they do that? At first, they were getting together just to weave, tell each other stories, maybe cry together, find somebody to listen to their stories. But the gatherings also became a space for creating connection, not just between the women and among the women, but women would start to communicate to others where to find resources, where to find food, what organizations were nearby and able to provide clothing or medicines. So these gatherings became a space for connecting women to resources for their actual physical survival. Some of the women became leaders within the community and started to open the doors of their new houses to newly displaced families. They organized themselves to provide childcare to the community so that some of the women could go out to work while someone else in the community cared for the children. They also acted as midwives for each other in an area in which there were no real hospitals because they were building a town from scratch. Let's not forget that. So passing down memories and knowledge of midwifery, healing practices, traditional healing practices that involved plants, things like that, was also part of what women were sharing and communicating to each other during these meetings to weave. So what they were doing here was to redefine care as something for the community and not just for an individual family. So the role of women traditionally in this region had been to care for her immediate family members. It had been just like woman, husband, children, parents, grandparents, that kind of family unit. And by extending that idea of care beyond the family unit, they were redefining care as something horizontal, trying to help each other rebuild the whole community, not just the family unit. So this part was very important, and it also became a space and a tool for political advocacy and for claiming and reclaiming human rights. So after sharing memories of loss and of war, of trauma, and articulating those memories through weaving, women created trust in each other, right? They had been through similar trauma together. So that really helped the formation of networks of trust and support that really sustained the community going forward. These groups also created spaces for what scholars of refugee care for refugees have described as psychological first aid, which means observing, listening, and connecting with the displaced community. Observing what are the basic needs that the recently displaced community needs to, what are the basic needs that the person or the community has right after displacement. Listening to their stories, listening to their own articulation of what it is they need, and then connecting those people to whatever resources they need in order to cover basic survival necessities. So really, these groups of women, especially the weavers of Mampuhan, were providing this psychological first aid to their communities and newly displaced people. Another care practice that involves memory was some of the women's initiatives for food sovereignty. So they started to replant gardens of medicinal plants that their communities had used traditionally for generations. So recreating access to food and also to local knowledge for healing was very important in continuing their own ancestral traditions. And so up to here, and to start a conclusion, I would like to bring us back to the main points that I think this story exemplifies, and some of the ways in which memory and humanities really connect to the survival, the physical survival of communities. So one point is how important it is to create spaces for narrative in contexts in which people have suffered unspeakable trauma. So memory initiatives, not just about writing or even not just about oral traditions, but also practices that have to do with the body, the senses, different ways to express things that might not be possible to express just with words. In that sense, the tapestries that the weavers of Mampuhan have created go beyond projects of creating institutional memories. So in Colombia, following all of this violence in the early 2000s, there have been efforts from the Colombian state and academia to recover the memories and kind of document what happened, when it happened, who did what to whom and why, all of that kind of in a very academic way that also includes the community, but it's very different from the type of memory repository that these tapestries have become. Another important thing here is that women-led initiatives really approach human dignity comprehensively. And this is something that they have articulated themselves. one of the women said, for example, okay, sometimes we get human rights organizations or NGOs in our territories trying to help, but they see the human experience as very fragmented and isolated. So if the organization is about food sovereignty, their aid is localized to just food sovereignty, or just, I don't know, physical health, or just education. But their approach is global, comprehensive. They say what we have lived has impacted community, culture, family bonds, physical health. And so our approach to rebuilding community has to be as comprehensive as the human being. So in this sense, culture, including memory, history, different care practices, really become crucial for community survival and resistance. And I would like to end by reading a quote by one of the community leaders, Olga Araujo, because she really articulates this idea in a very clear and beautiful way. So she says of her community of women, "We have understood that one of the things that allows the survival, the resistance of communities in the territories is culture. Culture obviously relates to everything: health, spirituality, flora, fauna, the relationship that the community has established with everything around it. This relationship is what has allowed the construction of knowledge that enables resistance and survival in our communities." Thank you all so much, and I'll look forward to some questions.
Thank you so much, Anna. That is a beautiful account of how people come through trauma, and I couldn't help but think of all the people facing that right now in Ukraine and Gaza. This is a global story of our time. So I want to open it now to questions, and I'll start over here. I have to circulate with the microphone, so it will be on the Zoom.
Your description of the community before the displacement sounded very male dominated. I know it's only been a couple of decades, but has through this process, have women become more important in the community as leaders through this process?
Yes, that is a wonderful question. And the communities were very, very marked by male dominance, kind of historically, since the colonial era. The men figure and ideas about honor and race also really shaped hierarchies in how leadership worked within these communities. And women-led initiatives, not just about memory, but specifically land ownership initiatives for women, have become so important and yet still very fragile and vulnerable. But today's vice president of Colombia is a woman who is of African descent, who comes from a background of community activism for land ownership. So some avenues have opened up while there's still a long road to go.
The question over here, so come around. I got to get my steps in. Yeah.
What a terrific presentation. Thank you. Where is this community now? I have my little map here and I tried to look up New Mampuhan and couldn't find it, but I do see the original. Where are they and how are they doing today?
Yeah, so the community is still located in the same mountain region. The municipal political unit is called Maria La Baja. So it's kind of, it's still a very small village, New Mampuhan. So what you will find on a map is the larger kind of county where it is located, Maria La Baja, similar region. Many of the women are still weaving, and they have been taking their workshops and teaching the same technique to women in other places in Colombia in which there have been similar processes of displacement. It's an initiative in a community that is well studied. People in Colombia know about the women and what they're doing. And some of their tapestries are even in the National Museum of History in Colombia today. And some of them are actually receiving compensation for their work.
Oh, we have a follow-up. I'm coming back here. Don't worry.
Are they able to market this material and share it? That's really important, I think.
Yeah, so there are different avenues for sharing the material and for getting compensated for the work they're doing. So some of it is leaving their pieces in consignment for the museum. Other museums and memory organizations commission work from these women to, make exhibits and things like that for the whole kind of reconciliation and peace initiatives in Colombia today, because there was negotiation between the government, the paramilitaries, and the FARC to kind of end that chapter of the violence. And so there's been a lot of state intervention and different kinds of initiatives from other local institutions to bring avenues for healing and memory making to different parts of the country. So some of the women and their work has been recognized in that context.
So I have at least 3 more questions here. I'll start.
I was going to ask you if you could comment on any other coping mechanisms that may have been observed in the Colombian community, and also how do those relate to mechanisms that may have been used by other refugee or displaced populations around the world?
Yeah, well, some other coping mechanisms that I have been reading about in this context in different regions, specifically involving women, which is what I'm interested in. There is a group of women for whom it is very important to create spaces to transfer traditional knowledge. So there's one community in the Pacific region of Colombia, also Afro-Colombian region, in which midwifery is a very important practice, community building practice. So the women in this particular community are creating organizations through which they can have midwives who are in their 70s and 80s to educate and teach midwifery practices to younger generations as a way to maintain the community sustenance in the face of lack of access to hospitals and things like that. Another thing that women talk about in the context of, I'm not sure if coping, but of resistance to this context of violence, is to, as they say it, and I kind of quote, is to not bear children for the war. So they have faced conflicts within their households, with their families and their husbands, because many women have refused to have children for this war. So that's another strategy. I don't know if it's a coping strategy.
It's an old one too.
resistance
That's an old strategy.
Yeah,
Lysistrata, the Greek.
that's something people talk about.
So I was struck too how enslaved women sang songs in the South to tell a story, or how artists like Picasso made Guernica to show suffering, or photography or writing. This is another coping mechanism that people find a way to tell their story. So that's fascinating.
Yes, I was interested in the prior ways in which culture was transmitted between generations, and I'm curious. I think I heard you say that quilting was introduced in the recent decades, but was there a visual arts tradition in this community or elsewhere in Colombia that they built upon on the fabrics and tapestries that were developed here?
Yeah, thank you. So yes, there has been tradition of painting. So there are a lot of different artistic expressions coming from people who have experienced this kind of displacement. So drawing, kind of pencil, black and white drawing is very common. Murals, so community practices for painting public spaces. That has been very important to reclaim those towns and cities that people left because of the forced displacement. So in coming back, they have tried to re-signify the space of terror as a space of life by organizing community mural painting strategies. Music, of course, is important too in this region, specifically music that has deep roots in African culture and history. So drumming practices, call and response song types, practices of singing for mourning, so singing during funerals, also come from a very, very long tradition of passing information and traditions from generation to generation. And another way in which these communities pass knowledge, cultural knowledge, to others is through cooking. So cooking is also something that comes up a lot in some of the people's stories, including the tapestries, right, with the person who depicted the traditional grinding method and the fruit and all of that. So making dishes in a particular way that has been traditional to the community is important, as well as growing their own produce as part of a traditional and cultural practice.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question here.
So I want to go back to the beginning and say, why was this small village initially targeted? And when they then left and found another place to take up residence, why was that village spared? And also, as they began their memory creation or coping mechanism, how did that community they came into respond to that? Because they themselves had not experienced this. So were they supportive? Did they not care? What was going on there?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, so the town was initially targeted because the paramilitary groups labeled town residents as collaborators with the guerrillas. So it's unclear if that was actually the case or if it was just an excuse for the paramilitaries to kind of move through that territory towards taking the area dominated by FARC. But that's kind of like what has transpired in the documents. Yeah, and just kind of saying, oh, you have collaborated with FARC, so now we're going to force you out of your territories. And then the second part of your question was?
And the town that they came into, which was not targeted
Yes.
by the paramilitary, they, I'm wondering why they weren't targeted, and also how did they respond to these individuals who came in? Were they accepting of this kind of practice? Did they start to say, oh, that could have been us? Or were they like, that's not us, so please leave, you know?
Yeah, so the displaced community was in the new town. Most of the families, 245 families who were in this new town, initially they were received well. They remember, they recall the generosity of the residents of the other town, but eventually tensions really started to develop there, especially because the town was so overcrowded. And as I showed in the pictures, these towns don't have a lot of infrastructure for 245 families that arrived overnight. So people do recall a lot of tensions emerging within the community of displaced people. So they were living in a school with no real sanitary conditions or anything, and tensions with the surrounding town. This town is not super close to Mampuhan, the new place where they were for 3 years. So I'm not sure what the geopolitics of that specific enclave were. But then when the displaced community founded their new town, they were spared because the paramilitaries had, how'd you say, they were not armed anymore. They had dissolved by 2005. Yeah.
We have a question here. Is the question on the Q&A? It's come in from someone. It's actually in English, so I'm going to read it. I was gonna Someone online is asking, as the male-dominated space changes, I wonder about how a similar project could work for men in the community. What would happen to men? Have there been ideas for workshops like this for the men? Can sex-segregated workshops like this allow both men and women to challenge traditional gender roles as they share? Are men more willing to show emotion if they're with women, and women more willing to speak out and claim power? So this raises a gender issue from one of our, actually it's a good lead into our next, but do you want to respond to what the men's role in this was?
Sure, yeah. So these are communities led by women, but they're not segregated to just women. So some men do participate in the workshops, especially in more recent years in which the weavers have become so prominent at the national level. And they have taken their workshop to different regions, so children participate, children of all genders participate. So it's not necessarily super segregated, but men do remain a minority.
Yeah, because are more men killed in the villages when they were displaced? Yeah,
Yes,
so
that is
more of
true.
the survivors were women, actually.
Yes,
Yeah.
and a lot of men actually migrated to cities as opposed to new towns to find work
Yeah.
in bigger cities. So there is kind of a slightly different dynamic, which doesn't mean that the workshops were completely segregated and not open
Yeah.
to others.
Well, we're going to have to take a break here, but I think this is a beautiful example of how communities show human resilience over time. And I think of how many people came to the United States, for example. We're going to move on to this subject too, fleeing traumatic displacements and trying then to reconstruct memory, which is why the humanities, I loved what you said about the humanities. Can't resist that. That without the humanities, there's no memory, and without memory, how can you thrive, you know, as an individual or as a community? So I hope you can see why we have wonderful new colleagues in the history department. Thank you all. Thank you so much, Anna. I learned so much from that. We're going to take about a 20-minute break. Those of you on the Zoom, you can go get a cup of coffee. We're going to have a break, and we'll resume in about 20 minutes at 10:45. Thank you so much.